The easiest person to underestimate is the one who never feels the need to explain who they are. The invitation arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, tucked between business correspondence and promotional mail inside Alicia Brooks's downtown apartment building. Outside, Manhattan moved with its usual rhythm. Yellow taxis flowed through crowded streets. Office workers hurried beneath glass towers. The city never seemed to pause for anyone. Alicia stood beside her kitchen counter holding a cup of coffee when she noticed the elegant cream-colored envelope. The handwriting immediately felt familiar, not because she recognized the sender, because she recognized the type of event. Formal, expensive, designed to impress. She opened it carefully and removed the invitation inside. Her eyes settled on a name she had not thought about in months. Derek Collins. For a moment, the apartment felt unusually quiet. Sunlight filtered through large windows overlooking the city while distant traffic hummed below. Alicia read the invitation again. Derek and his fiancée, Brittany Hayes, were hosting an engagement celebration at one of the most prestigious hotels in New York. Friends, family, business associates, and social elites would attend. The guest list was clearly intended to be impressive. What surprised Alicia was not the event itself. It was the fact that she had been invited. She lowered the invitation onto the countertop and stared out the window. For years had passed since the divorce. For years since she walked away from a marriage that had slowly transformed into something neither of them recognized anymore. Time had created distance. Healing had created perspective. Yet seeing Derek's name unexpectedly pulled old memories into the room. Not painful memories, just reminders of a life that no longer belonged to her. Across town, preparations for the engagement celebration were already underway. The ballroom had been reserved months in advance. Floral arrangements arrived throughout the day. Event planners coordinated seating charts and lighting displays. Everything reflected the image Derek wanted to project. Success, sophistication, momentum. Near the hotel lobby, Brittany reviewed final details with the event coordinator. She appeared excited, confident. Several family members moved through the venue discussing guests who would attend. During one conversation, Alicia's name surfaced unexpectedly. An older relative laughed softly. "Do you think she will actually show up?" Brittany smiled. "I hope so." Another guest raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Brittany adjusted a decorative menu card before answering. "Because everyone loves a reminder of how much life can change." Several people laughed politely. The comment drifted through the room and disappeared into other conversations. Yet the meaning behind it remained clear. To many of them, Alicia represented the past, a chapter already closed, a woman whose story ended years ago. None of them considered the possibility that they knew almost nothing about her life now. Back inside her apartment, Alicia placed the invitation on the dining table and returned to work. Client meetings filled her calendar. Community projects demanded attention. Life had become full in ways she never expected after the divorce. She no longer measured her value through social approval. She no longer worried about proving herself. Yet as the afternoon passed, she occasionally glanced toward the invitation. Not because she wanted to revisit the past, because she sensed something unusual beneath the surface. That evening, her phone rang. The screen displayed a name that instantly softened her expression. Victoria Brooks. Alicia smiled before answering. Her mother's voice carried the calm confidence that had always made difficult situations seem manageable. They discussed family matters, upcoming travel plans, and ordinary events from the week. Near the end of the conversation, Victoria asked a simple question. "You sound thoughtful. What happened?" Alicia laughed softly. An invitation arrived. "Interesting." Alicia glanced toward the dining table. Possibly. Outside, the city lights gradually replaced the fading sunlight. Inside the apartment, Alicia listened as her mother asked a few quiet questions. Neither woman realized that a single invitation had just set an extraordinary chain of events into motion. Because somewhere inside a luxury ballroom still being prepared for celebration, dozens of people were already expecting Alicia Brooks to arrive as the least important person in the room. And before the evening was over, every one of them would discover how wrong they were. The week leading up to the engagement celebration seemed to generate more excitement for everyone except Alicia Brooks. While social media filled with photographs of floral arrangements, venue previews, and carefully staged countdown posts, she continued living her life exactly as she always had. Client meetings occupied her mornings. Community outreach projects filled her afternoons. Evenings were often spent reviewing proposals or sharing dinner with close friends. The invitation remained on a small table near her living room window, untouched since the day it arrived. Yet elsewhere in New York, anticipation surrounding the event continued to grow. Derek Collins and Brittany Hayes had built the celebration into something much larger than a simple engagement party. It had become a social event. Influential guests confirmed attendance. Business partners adjusted schedules. Family members discussed seating arrangements as though preparing for a major public occasion. More importantly, stories about Alicia began quietly circulating among those expected to attend. Most of those stories shared one thing in common. None of them reflected reality. One afternoon, Brittany joined several relatives for lunch at an upscale restaurant overlooking Central Park. Sunlight streamed through the windows, while conversations flowed easily around the table. The discussion eventually turned toward the guest list. When Alicia's name surfaced, several smiles appeared immediately. One cousin leaned forward. "I still cannot believe she accepted the invitation." Brittany stirred her coffee. "Neither can I." Another relative laughed softly. "Maybe she wants everyone to see how well she is doing." The comment triggered polite amusement around the table. Someone else shook their head. "Or maybe she wants everyone to think she is doing well." The distinction seemed entertaining to them. Brittany smiled but said nothing. She had never openly criticized Alicia. She simply allowed assumptions to survive without correction. That often proved more effective. Across the table, one guest glanced toward Brittany. "Do you think it will be awkward?" Brittany finally answered. "Only if someone makes it awkward." The response sounded gracious. Yet everyone understood the implication. Alicia would arrive as the outsider, the former wife, the woman connected to an old chapter nobody wanted to revisit. By the time lunch ended, several guests had already decided what Alicia's appearance would mean before she even entered the room. Across the city, Alicia remained completely unaware of the conversation. She spent that afternoon attending a youth mentorship fundraiser in Brooklyn. The event was modest compared to the luxury celebrations dominating social media feeds. Folding tables replaced crystal centerpieces. Community volunteers replaced celebrities. Yet Alicia seemed entirely comfortable there. She listened carefully as students shared future goals. She offered encouragement. She helped coordinate resources. No cameras followed her. No publicity surrounded the effort. She simply believed the work mattered. As the event concluded, one of the organizers thanked her for participating. Alicia smiled warmly and insisted the gratitude belonged to the volunteers. Moments like that revealed something most people never understood about her. She never felt compelled to announce her value. She simply lived it. That evening, while returning home through Manhattan traffic, Alicia received another call from her mother. Victoria Brooks sounded relaxed, as though discussing nothing more important than weekend plans. They talked about family updates, business travel, and an upcoming charity initiative. Eventually, Victoria asked about the invitation again. Alicia laughed softly. "You are more interested in this party than I am." Victoria's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Maybe I am interested in people underestimating my daughter." Alicia looked out the car window as city lights blurred past. "People have been doing that for years. And how has that worked out for them?" Alicia smiled. The answer required no explanation. Meanwhile, preparations for the celebration entered their final stage. Guests exchanged messages. Expectations grew. Assumptions hardened. Many believed Alicia would arrive carrying disappointment. Others expected insecurity. A few anticipated embarrassment. None of them imagined that the woman they planned to discuss over cocktails possessed a story they had never bothered to learn. And none of them realized that before the night ended, every careless assumption would be challenged by a truth far bigger than any of them were prepared to hear. Most people at the upcoming celebration believed they already knew Alicia Brooks's story. That assumption existed because Alicia had never corrected them. For years, she allowed people to create their own explanations. Some believed she came from an ordinary background and simply married well before the relationship failed. Others assumed she spent years struggling after the divorce. A few imagined she lived quietly somewhere outside the circles that once included her. The truth was far more complicated. Alicia had spent most of her adult life hiding a part of herself that could have opened almost any door she wanted. Not because she was ashamed of it, because she wanted to know which opportunities belonged to her and which belonged to her family name. On a cool Thursday morning, Sunlight poured through the windows of her Manhattan apartment as she prepared for another workday. The city stretched beneath her balcony in every direction. Construction cranes moved across the skyline. Ferries crossed the river. Life continued with relentless energy. Alicia reviewed documents at her dining table while her phone buzzed periodically with messages from colleagues and community partners. To anyone observing her routine, she appeared successful but ordinary. That perception had followed her for years. Very few people questioned it. Across town, however, another conversation about Alicia unfolded inside a private dining room where several guests planned to attend Derek and Brittany's engagement celebration. They discussed seating arrangements, business connections, and social dynamics. Eventually, someone mentioned Alicia's attendance. One guest laughed. "I still cannot believe she accepted." Another nodded. "I would have stayed home." The group agreed. In their minds, appearing at the celebration required either courage or desperation. Since none of them truly understood Alicia, they chose the explanation that entertained them most. Meanwhile, Alicia's morning continued uninterrupted. Shortly before noon, she stepped into a black town car waiting outside her building and headed toward a nonprofit leadership conference in Midtown. During the drive, her thoughts drifted briefly toward childhood memories. Not because she was feeling nostalgic, because conversations about identity often resurfaced whenever major events approached. Growing up, Alicia learned early that her mother occupied a world most people never experienced. Private aircraft, international board meetings, financial publications, headlines discussing billion-dollar acquisitions. Yet inside their home, Victoria Brooks rarely discussed wealth. She discussed responsibility, discipline, character. Alicia remembered one particular conversation from years earlier. She had been 17 when she asked why her mother never introduced her through family status. Victoria smiled and gave an answer Alicia never forgot. "Because I want people to meet you before they meet your last name." That lesson shaped everything that followed. When Alicia attended college, almost nobody knew who her mother was. When she started her career, she avoided using family influence. When she met Derek years later, she deliberately kept her background private. She wanted a relationship built on authenticity rather than access. At the time, it felt like the right choice. Looking back now, she still believed it was. The conference ended late that afternoon. As guests exited into the city, Alicia stood near the entrance speaking with community leaders about future projects. Several participants thanked her for her contributions. Others requested future meetings. None of them mentioned her family. None of them needed to. The respect she received belonged entirely to her own efforts. That evening, Alicia returned home and found another message from her mother waiting on her phone. Victoria planned to arrive in New York the following week. The timing seemed casual enough. Yet Alicia sensed there was more behind the decision. Victoria rarely traveled without purpose. Looking out across the city lights from her apartment window, Alicia smiled to herself. Somewhere across Manhattan, dozens of people continued preparing for a celebration where they expected her to play a very specific role. The former wife. The forgotten chapter. The woman whose best years supposedly belonged to the past. None of them understood that the most important part of Alicia's story had never been revealed. And very soon, the secret she spent years protecting would walk into the same room as every person who underestimated her. The closer the engagement celebration approached, the less attention Alicia Brooks gave to it. That surprised even her. For years earlier, the thought of walking into a room filled with people connected to Derek Collins might have unsettled her. Now it felt like any other appointment on her calendar, important only because it occupied a block of time. On a bright Friday morning, she stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of her apartment watching sunlight spill across Manhattan. The city seemed endless from this height. Glass towers reflected the sky. Traffic moved steadily below. Ferries crossed the river like white brushstrokes against blue water. Her phone buzzed with reminders for meetings, but her attention drifted toward a framed photograph resting on a nearby shelf. The picture showed her and her mother years earlier during a charity event. Neither wore expensive designer labels. Neither stood in front of cameras. They were laughing at something outside the frame. Looking at the photograph reminded Alicia of how much her life had changed since the divorce. Yet it also reminded her that some things never had. Her mother remained her greatest source of strength. Not because of wealth, because of wisdom. Victoria Brooks had spent decades building one of the most respected business empires in the country, yet the lessons she valued most had nothing to do with money. Character mattered. Integrity mattered. Quiet confidence mattered. Those principles shaped Alicia long before anyone knew her name. Later that afternoon, Victoria arrived in New York. Her private schedule remained intentionally low profile, something that often surprised people who only knew her public reputation. She preferred meaningful conversations to attention, influence to publicity, results to headlines. When Alicia met her mother for dinner that evening, they chose a small restaurant overlooking the Hudson River rather than one of the city's trendiest locations. Candlelight reflected softly across the windows while boats moved through the water beyond. Their conversation flowed easily. Family stories, community projects, future plans. Eventually, the upcoming celebration entered the discussion. Victoria listened quietly as Alicia described the invitation and some of the assumptions surrounding it. She smiled once the story finished. People often confuse silence with weakness. Alicia laughed softly. That sounds familiar. Because it is true. Victoria took a sip of tea. The loudest people in the room are rarely the strongest. The conversation moved on, but the words lingered. Across Manhattan, preparations for the engagement celebration accelerated. Floral installations filled the hotel ballroom. Lighting crews adjusted final details. Luxury vehicles arrived throughout the day, delivering decorations and equipment. Derek moved through the venue with visible satisfaction. Everything looked exactly the way he wanted. Elegant, impressive, controlled. Family members praised the arrangements. Friends complimented the scale of the event. Brittany appeared equally pleased. Yet beneath the excitement, one recurring topic continued resurfacing. Alicia. During a rehearsal dinner gathering, several guests discussed her expected arrival. Some wondered what she would wear. Others speculated about her career. A few quietly questioned whether she had truly moved on. None of them possessed actual information. Assumptions filled the empty spaces. The irony was almost remarkable. The woman they discussed more than anyone else had not spoken about them at all. The following morning, Alicia and Victoria spent several hours visiting a youth development center supported by one of their charitable foundations. The facility buzzed with activity. Students participated in workshops. Volunteers coordinated programs. Community leaders discussed expansion plans. Throughout the visit, Victoria greeted everyone with the same warmth and respect. Watching her mother interact with people from every background reminded Alicia of something important. True influence never needed an introduction. It revealed itself through actions. As the day ended, they stood outside the center watching the sun disappear behind the skyline. Victoria glanced toward her daughter. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Alicia smiled. "For a party?" Victoria returned the smile. "No, for whatever comes after." The answer remained unspoken between them. Somewhere across the city, dozens of guests were preparing for an evening they believed would confirm everything they already thought about Alicia Brooks. None of them realized that the woman they expected to quietly endure their assumptions would soon walk into the room accompanied by the one person whose presence could change the entire atmosphere without saying more than a few words. The morning of the engagement celebration arrived with the kind of clear autumn weather New York residents appreciated after weeks of unpredictable forecasts. Sunlight reflected off skyscraper windows while the city moved with its usual confidence. Inside luxury hotels, restaurants, and event venues, preparations accelerated toward evening. For most guests, the celebration represented a social occasion. For Alicia Brooks, it remained little more than a date on her calendar. She spent the first half of the day exactly as she spent most Saturdays. Working, visiting community programs, returning calls, living her life. If anyone expected her to spend hours worrying about Derek Collins's event, they would have been disappointed. Across town, however, excitement continued building. The ballroom looked extraordinary. Crystal chandeliers illuminated towering floral displays. Elegant table settings stretched across the room beneath carefully designed lighting. Staff members moved efficiently between final preparations while event coordinators reviewed schedules. Every detail reflected prestige. Every detail communicated status. Derek arrived early to inspect the venue. Walking through the ballroom, he felt satisfied. Friends greeted him. Family members praised the arrangements. Brittany appeared radiant as photographers captured pre-event images for private albums and social media highlights. Everything looked perfect. Yet throughout the afternoon, one topic repeatedly surfaced among guests and relatives. Alicia. Several people wondered if she would actually attend. Others discussed what she might say. A few seemed strangely excited by the possibility of awkwardness. The speculation revealed something interesting. Years after the divorce, Alicia still occupied space in their thoughts despite rarely speaking to any of them. Meanwhile, several miles away, Alicia sat with Victoria Brooks in a quiet lounge overlooking the Hudson River. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the water while boats moved steadily between shorelines. Neither woman seemed rushed. Victoria reviewed notes for upcoming business meetings. Alicia answered messages from colleagues. The atmosphere felt peaceful. At one point, Victoria closed a folder and looked toward her daughter. "You know what fascinates me?" Alicia smiled. "What?" "How often people create stories when they do not have facts." Alicia laughed softly. "That happens more than most people realize." Victoria nodded. "And those stories usually tell us more about them than the person they are discussing." The observation lingered between them. As evening approached, they returned separately to prepare for the celebration. Alicia selected an elegant navy gown defined more by sophistication than extravagance. She preferred timeless style over attention. Looking into the mirror, she saw neither the former wife people expected nor the hidden heiress they had never imagined. She simply saw herself. That realization brought an unexpected sense of calm. Across the city, luxury vehicles began arriving outside the hotel entrance. Guests stepped onto red carpets beneath warm exterior lighting. Conversations flowed. Cameras flashed. Inside the ballroom, familiar assumptions continued circulating. Some guests expected Alicia to arrive alone. Others imagined she would appear uncomfortable. A few privately hoped for drama. Human nature often gravitates toward spectacle. Yet none of them realized that the evening's most significant arrival had not occurred yet. Shortly after sunset, Victoria completed her final meeting of the day. The conference room overlooking Midtown gradually emptied as executives gathered documents and prepared to leave. Several individuals remained behind momentarily to thank her for her time. Their respect was unmistakable, not exaggerated, genuine. One executive adjusted his schedule simply to accompany her to the elevator. Another postponed a call rather than leave before saying goodbye. Reactions like these followed Victoria everywhere, though she rarely acknowledged them. To her, influence was a responsibility rather than a performance. As she exited the building, the city lights had fully awakened around her. Traffic flowed beneath illuminated skyscrapers. Digital billboards glowed against the evening sky. A waiting vehicle pulled quietly to the curb. Victoria entered without fanfare and looked through the window as Manhattan passed outside. Somewhere ahead, guests were gathering inside a ballroom where many believed they already understood Alicia Brooks. They believed they knew her history. They believed they knew her worth. Most importantly, they believed they knew her place. What none of them understood was that the woman they planned to quietly judge that evening was connected to one of the most respected figures in the country. And before the night was over, the arrival of a single person would begin unraveling every assumption they had spent years believing. The ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers as guests filled the grand hotel with conversation, laughter, and the quiet confidence that comes from believing you understand everyone in the room. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays. A string quartet played near the stage. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sparkling Manhattan skyline beyond. Everything about the evening reflected elegance. Everything felt carefully controlled. Derek Collins stood near the center of the ballroom greeting arriving guests alongside Brittany Hayes. Family members mingled nearby. Business associates exchanged handshakes and introductions. The celebration unfolded exactly as planned, at least for the moment. Shortly after 8 o'clock, a subtle shift began near the entrance. It was not dramatic enough for everyone to notice immediately. A few heads turned, then several more. Conversations paused briefly before resuming. The movement resembled a ripple spreading across still water. Derek glanced toward the entrance, but saw only another arriving guest. Moments later, however, the ripple returned. This time it lasted longer. Alicia Brooks had arrived. She entered the ballroom alone, moving with calm confidence through the entrance beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Her navy gown reflected understated sophistication. Her posture remained relaxed. She was neither nervous nor eager for attention. She simply looked comfortable. Several guests immediately recognized her. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others whispered quietly. A few smiled with thinly disguised curiosity. The assumptions that had circulated for weeks suddenly found a living target. Yet Alicia appeared completely unaffected. She greeted a few familiar faces, thanked the event staff, and accepted a glass of sparkling water before moving toward a quieter area near the windows. Across the room, Derek watched her for a moment longer than he intended. For years had passed since the divorce, yet seeing her unexpectedly stirred memories he thought had faded. What surprised him most was not her appearance. It was her composure. She looked completely at peace. Nearby, several guests continued their observations. One woman whispered, "She seems different." Another nodded, "Much different." Yet before those conversations could continue, something else happened. Outside the hotel entrance, another vehicle arrived. Unlike Alicia's arrival, this one immediately attracted attention from people who recognized the passenger. The hotel's general manager appeared near the lobby doors. Two senior executives from the event sponsor interrupted their conversation. A board member from one of the city's largest charitable organizations quietly moved toward the entrance. None of them were instructed to do so. Their reactions happened naturally. Inside the ballroom, most guests remained unaware of the significance. They continued socializing while the subtle change gathered momentum. Then Victoria Brooks entered the hotel. She moved through the lobby with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to important rooms without needing to dominate them. Her elegant evening attire reflected refinement rather than excess. She smiled warmly at staff members who greeted her and thanked several people by name. Observers unfamiliar with her identity simply saw a distinguished woman arriving at an upscale event. Those who recognized her reacted very differently. Near the ballroom entrance, one executive quietly lowered his voice. "Victoria Brooks is here." Another immediately turned toward the doors. The reaction spread among certain guests with remarkable speed. Yet inside the main ballroom, most people had not connected anything. Not yet. Alicia remained near the windows speaking with a nonprofit director about community initiatives. She had no idea how many eyes were beginning to follow her mother's arrival. Victoria entered the ballroom calmly and paused briefly near the entrance. Conversations continued. Music played. Glasses clinked softly. Yet within seconds, more people began noticing her presence. Several influential guests excused themselves from ongoing discussions. Others adjusted their paths across the room. One donor quietly left a conversation with Derek to greet her personally. The pattern repeated again and again. Respect. Recognition. Attention. Derek noticed it immediately. Looking across the ballroom, he followed the movement of the crowd toward the elegant woman near the entrance. He did not recognize her, but he instantly understood one thing. Someone important had just arrived. What he did not know was that the most significant connection in the room remained completely hidden. For now, Victoria Brooks was simply a distinguished guest. And within the next hour, that single misunderstanding would completely change the course of the evening. Within 20 minutes of Victoria Brooks entering the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed in ways most guests could feel but could not yet explain. Conversations shifted direction. Social circles rearranged themselves. People who normally commanded attention suddenly found themselves watching someone else. Near the entrance, executives, philanthropists, and investors continued approaching Victoria with visible respect. None of them behaved as though they were greeting a celebrity. Their reactions reflected something deeper. Recognition, admiration, influence earned over decades. Derek Collins observed the pattern from across the room. The more he watched, the more curious he became. He eventually turned toward one of his business associates standing nearby. "Who exactly is she?" The associate looked surprised by the question. "You do not know?" Derek shook his head. The associate glanced toward Victoria again before answering. "That is Victoria Brooks." The name landed softly. Derek recognized it immediately. Almost everyone in business circles did. Financial publications featured her regularly. Leadership conferences requested her presence years in advance. Universities invited her to speak. Major charitable organizations competed for her support. She had built one of the most respected investment groups in the country while quietly funding educational and community programs nationwide. Derek felt a brief moment of disbelief. Of all the people who could have entered his engagement celebration, Victoria Brooks was among the last he expected. Nearby guests reacted similarly. Some discussed her accomplishments. Others speculated about why she attended. A few wondered whether she knew the hosts personally. Nobody had an answer. Meanwhile, Victoria moved comfortably through the ballroom, greeting familiar faces with genuine warmth. She never appeared interested in being the center of attention. Ironically, that only increased the attention surrounding her. Across the room, Alicia Brooks remained near the windows speaking with a nonprofit director and several community leaders. She seemed completely unconcerned by the growing excitement. That detail escaped most guests. They focused entirely on Victoria. What they failed to notice was how often Victoria's gaze drifted toward Alicia. The connection was subtle enough to avoid suspicion. For now, as the evening continued, Brittany Hayes eventually approached Victoria alongside Derek. The introduction felt almost inevitable. Brittany smiled politely. Derek extended his hand. Victoria greeted both graciously. The conversation remained pleasant, professional, brief. Yet Derek found himself unexpectedly nervous. Few people possess the ability to make a room feel smaller simply by entering it. Victoria was clearly one of them. After several minutes, another guest joined the discussion. Then another. Soon a small circle formed around Victoria. Questions flowed naturally. Topics ranged from philanthropy to education to economic development. Victoria answered thoughtfully without dominating the conversation. Her confidence required no performance. Watching from nearby, several guests quietly expressed admiration. One woman whispered, "She is extraordinary." Another nodded immediately. You can understand why everyone respects her. Yet as impressive as Victoria appeared, the most significant moment of the evening arrived unexpectedly. During a conversation about community investment projects, one executive mentioned a recent initiative that had transformed educational opportunities in several neighborhoods. He praised the leadership behind the effort and turned toward Alicia across the room. The real credit belongs to Alicia. Several nearby guests followed his gaze. For a moment, confusion appeared. Then curiosity. Victoria smiled warmly. Not the polite smile she had offered throughout the evening. Something more personal, more meaningful. The executive continued speaking. Honestly, I have learned as much from Alicia as anyone in this field. Another community leader agreed immediately. Others began sharing similar observations. One praised her leadership. Another praised her integrity. A third praised her commitment to service. The compliments arrived naturally. Unscripted. Genuine. Derek listened carefully. So did Brittany. So did dozens of people who had spent weeks assuming they already understood Alicia Brooks. Slowly, attention began shifting. Not away from Victoria, toward the unexpected connection forming between the most respected woman in the room and the woman many guests had spent years underestimating. Victoria looked toward Alicia once more. This time the expression on her face was impossible to miss. Pride. Deep and unmistakable pride. Several guests noticed it immediately. Questions began forming. Conversations quieted. Curiosity spread through the ballroom. The evening was no longer unfolding according to anyone's expectations. And within the next few minutes, a single truth would emerge that would leave the entire room speechless. The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter. Not because the music had stopped or because guests had left. The silence came from something far more powerful. Curiosity. People sensed that an answer was approaching. They simply did not know what the question was yet. Clusters of guests continued watching Victoria Brooks and Alicia from different corners of the room. The connection between them had become impossible to ignore. Every glance Victoria directed toward Alicia carried unmistakable warmth. Every mention of Alicia's accomplishments seemed to bring visible pride to Victoria's face. Those observations spread through the ballroom faster than any announcement could have. Derek Collins noticed it. Brittany Hayes noticed it. So did nearly everyone else. Near the center of the room, several executives stood discussing educational initiatives when one of them approached Alicia directly. He thanked her for helping launch a scholarship program that had transformed opportunities for hundreds of students. Others joined the conversation. A nonprofit director praised her leadership. A community organizer spoke about her dedication. The compliments arrived one after another. Alicia accepted them graciously but never appeared eager to prolong the attention. Her humility only made the admiration stronger. Victoria watched quietly from nearby. Eventually, one of the guests standing beside her smiled and asked a simple question. How long have you known Alicia? The answer could not have sounded more ordinary. Her entire life. The guest laughed politely, then paused. Something in Victoria's expression caused the meaning to settle differently. Nearby conversation slowed. Several people glanced between the two women. Victoria remained calm, unhurried, comfortable. She had spent decades speaking in boardrooms and public forums. She understood the value of timing. The guest tilted her head slightly. You mean? Victoria smiled warmly. Alicia is my daughter. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire ballroom had stopped breathing. The words traveled outward in waves. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Guests exchanged stunned looks. Some people immediately assumed they had misunderstood. Others quietly repeated the statement to confirm what they had heard. Alicia Brooks, daughter of Victoria Brooks. The realization moved through the room with astonishing speed. Derek stared across the ballroom, unable to hide his surprise. Brittany's expression changed instantly. Family members who had spent weeks discussing Alicia suddenly fell silent. The assumptions that once felt so certain now appeared almost absurd. Several guests began replaying years of memories through an entirely different lens. They remembered Alicia declining opportunities to discuss her background. They remembered her avoiding status conversations. They remembered how little she had ever said about her family. What they once interpreted as ordinary circumstances suddenly looked like intentional privacy. Victoria never raised her voice. She never delivered a speech. She never corrected anyone publicly. She simply continued speaking naturally with those around her. Yet her quiet confirmation accomplished more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. The truth stood on its own. Across the room, a board member from a major charitable organization approached Alicia with renewed understanding. So did several business leaders. Others who had barely acknowledged her earlier now seemed eager to introduce themselves. The contrast was impossible to miss. Alicia noticed it immediately. Yet her reaction remained exactly the same as before. Polite, calm, unchanged. That detail perhaps surprised people most. She did not appear vindicated. She did not appear triumphant. She simply remained herself. Watching from nearby, Derek felt something unexpected. It was not embarrassment. It was perspective. For years he believed he understood Alicia completely. He thought he knew where she came from, what she valued, what she lacked. Standing in the ballroom now, he realized how little he had actually known. The woman he once underestimated had spent years building her own reputation despite having access to one of the most powerful family names in the country. She never used it as a shortcut, never used it as a shield, never used it to impress anyone. Around the ballroom, conversations slowly resumed. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. The social hierarchy people assumed existed at the beginning of the evening had quietly collapsed. The room no longer saw Alicia as someone's former wife. They saw her as a remarkable woman whose character had always mattered more than her connections. And as Victoria looked proudly toward her daughter beneath the glow of the chandeliers, one final realization settled over the ballroom. The most powerful person in the room was not the billionaire everyone recognized. It was the woman who never needed anyone to know who her mother was. As the evening entered its final hour, the ballroom slowly transformed from a place of celebration into a room filled with reflection. The revelation about Alicia Brooks had spread to every corner of the venue. Conversations continued, but their tone had changed. The assumptions that once fueled quiet laughter and casual judgment had disappeared. In their place stood something far more powerful: respect. Near the grand windows overlooking Manhattan, Alicia stood beside her mother as city lights stretched endlessly across the night skyline. The view was breathtaking, yet neither woman seemed particularly interested in drawing attention to themselves. They spoke quietly, occasionally smiling as guests approached to offer greetings and congratulations. Across the ballroom, Derek Collins watched the scene unfold. For the first time all evening, he was not focused on appearances, status, or social expectations. He was focused on understanding. The woman he once believed he knew had become a stranger in the most unexpected way. Not because Alicia had changed into someone else, because he had never truly understood who she was to begin with. Throughout their marriage, she had never mentioned her mother's influence. never used family connections to gain advantages, never introduced herself through power or wealth. Looking back, Derek realized she had spent years proving herself on her own terms while he never bothered to ask why. Nearby, Brittany remained unusually quiet. Earlier in the evening, she had enjoyed the attention surrounding the celebration. Now she seemed more interested in observing Alicia than competing with her. The contrast between them had become impossible to ignore. Alicia had entered the ballroom, carrying no desire to impress anyone. Yet she had become the most respected person in the room. Not because of her family name, because the revelation only confirmed what many community leaders, nonprofit directors, and professionals already knew. Her character existed long before anyone discovered her background. As guests prepared to leave, several people approached Alicia one final time. A foundation director thanked her for years of service. A business leader praised her integrity. A young nonprofit volunteer expressed gratitude for mentorship that had changed her career path. None of the compliments mentioned money. None mentioned influence. Every word focused on who Alicia was as a person. Victoria listened proudly, but remained silent. She understood something most people in the room were only beginning to learn. True success is measured by the lives you impact, not the titles attached to your name. Eventually, the ballroom began emptying. Staff members quietly cleared tables while musicians prepared to finish their final performance. The celebration that had once seemed so important was gradually fading into memory. Yet one moment remained. As Alicia and Victoria prepared to leave, Derek approached them. The conversation lasted less than a minute. No dramatic speeches followed. No emotional confrontation unfolded. Derek simply looked at Alicia and offered a sincere smile. "I am glad you came." Alicia returned the smile with calm grace. "So am I." That was all. No discussion of the past. No revisiting old mistakes. No attempt to rewrite history. Some chapters do not need to be reopened to achieve closure. They only need to be understood. A few moments later, Alicia and Victoria walked toward the ballroom exit together. Guests watched them leave with a level of admiration that had not existed when the evening began. The irony was unmistakable. The woman many expected to quietly endure judgment had become the person everyone respected most. Not because she revealed a powerful connection, because she never relied on it. Outside the hotel, cool autumn air greeted them as Manhattan sparkled beneath the night sky. Their vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the city lights. Inside the ballroom, Derek remained standing near the windows long after many guests had gone home. Looking across the skyline, he finally understood something that had escaped him for years. Alicia Brooks had never needed saving. She had never needed validation. She had never needed permission to become extraordinary. The only thing she ever needed was the opportunity to be herself. And while others spent years laughing at what they assumed she lacked, Alicia quietly built a life defined by dignity, purpose, and strength. In the end, the most powerful voice in the room had not been the billionaire mother who revealed the truth. It had been the silence of a woman who never felt the need to prove her worth to anyone.